Imagine you've been accused of stealing your neighbor's grain. You say you didn't do it. Your neighbor says you did. In the 21st century, you'd go to court. A judge would hear evidence. Witnesses would testify. There'd be a process, a procedure, a paper trail. In medieval Europe, you'd be handed a bar of iron heated until it glowed red, told to carry it 9 steps, and then your wound would be wrapped and checked 3 days later. If it was healing cleanly, God had declared you innocent. If it was infected and festering, guilty. Case closed. That was the legal system. Trial by ordeal wasn't a punishment, it was a verdict. It was the mechanism of determining guilt or innocence in the first place. And for several centuries across Europe, it was considered not just acceptable, but divinely sanctioned, a direct appeal to God's judgment when human judgment couldn't settle the matter. The logic, strange as it sounds to modern ears, was internally coherent within a medieval worldview. If you genuinely believed that God was omniscient, omnipresent, and actively involved in human affairs, then why wouldn't he intervene to protect the innocent and expose the guilty? The ordeal wasn't cruelty for cruelty's sake, it was theology made physical. There were several varieties of ordeal, each with their own horrifying mechanics. Trial by hot iron was perhaps the most common. The accused was required to carry a heated iron bar, sometimes weighing several pounds, for a designated distance, usually 9 feet or more. The hand was then bandaged by a priest who would inspect the wound 3 days later. Medieval medicine didn't understand germ theory, but they understood the visual difference between a wound healing cleanly and one that was swollen, oozing, and blackened. Clean healing? Innocent. Infection? Guilty. The irony is that sweat, which reduces grip and increases friction, or exposure to dirt, actually increased infection rates, meaning the guilty verdict often had nothing to do with actual guilt. Trial by cold water was equally memorable. The accused was bound, sometimes hand to foot, sometimes just the wrists, and lowered into a body of water blessed by a priest. The underlying theology here was that holy water, being pure, would reject the sinful. Floating meant the water had cast you out. Guilty. Thinking meant you were accepted. Innocent. The obvious problem, which medieval courts addressed with varying degrees of care, was that innocent people could drown before anyone pulled them out. Some accounts suggest a rope was tied to allow retrieval. Others suggest the rope was more ceremonial than functional. Trial by hot water required plunging the hand or arm into boiling water to retrieve an object, a stone or a ring, placed at the bottom. Same healing inspection process afterward. What's fascinating about the ordeal system isn't just its cruelty, it's its social function. In communities without police forces, forensic science, or reliable record keeping, the ordeal served as a powerful social mechanism. The fear of divine judgment likely produced confessions in many cases before the ordeal even began, and the community's shared belief in the system made it function. Outcomes were accepted, disputes resolved, order maintained. The clergy performed these rituals, churches hosted them, bishops blessed the iron and the water. The ordeal was sacred infrastructure. And then in 1215, something remarkable happened. Pope Innocent III convened the Fourth Lateran Council and, among many other things, formally banned priests from participating in trials by ordeal. This wasn't primarily a humanitarian gesture. There were political, theological, and jurisdictional considerations at play. But without priestly blessing, the ordeal lost its divine legitimacy. Courts scrambled for alternatives. What replaced it? Jury trials in many places. The system we still use today. Imperfect, occasionally absurd, frequently frustrating, emerged partly because the hot iron became unavailable. But here's what should really get under your skin. For the centuries the ordeal existed, it wasn't considered barbaric. It was considered merciful. It gave the accused a chance. It appealed to a higher authority than any biased human judge. Peasants and nobles alike submitted to it, demanded it, and trusted it. History's lesson from the ordeal isn't that medieval people were primitive. It's that every system of justice reflects the cosmology of the people who built it, their beliefs about the universe, about guilt, about who gets to decide. Medieval courts asked God. We ask 12 strangers in a box. Neither system is perfect. Only one involves molten metal. The ordeal wasn't abolished because people stopped believing in it. It was abolished because an institution decided to stop supporting it. That's a different thing, and more disturbing thing. Beliefs don't die when they're wrong. They die when they lose institutional backing. For centuries after the formal ban, folk versions of the ordeal persisted. Suspected witches were thrown into ponds in rural England well into the 17th century. The logic didn't disappear, it just lost its church letterhead. One more layer to consider: the psychology of the accused. Scholars who've studied ordeal records note that survival rates were surprisingly high, higher than you'd expect if the process were entirely random. One theory is that priests, who control the temperature of the iron and the heat of the water, exercised quiet discretion. A priest who knew the accused, believed in their innocence, or had been persuaded by community opinion might ensure a slightly cooler bar, a briefer dunking, a more generous healing assessment. In other words, human judgment crept back through the ritual of divine judgment. People couldn't fully remove themselves from the process, even when they were trying to hand it to God. The trial by ordeal, then, is a remarkably human institution. Flawed, manipulable, deeply sincere, and occasionally murderous, just like every justice system that came after it.
Somewhere in Europe, right now, there is a graveyard. And if you could go back 500 years and dig up some of the coffins in that graveyard, which please don't, you might find something inside some of them that would keep you awake for the rest of your life. Scratch marks on the inside of the lid. The fear of premature burial, being mistakenly declared dead and interred while still alive, was not a superstition in medieval Europe. It was a documented, recurring reality, and the responses to it shaped burial customs, graveyard design, architectural innovation, and an entire industry of safety devices that persisted into the 19th century and beyond. To understand how this happened, you need to understand medieval medicine's fundamental limitation. There was no reliable way to confirm death. Modern medicine confirms death through cessation of brain activity, absence of cardiac rhythm, clinical signs measured by machines that didn't exist until the 20th century. Medieval physicians, and they were real physicians, trained in formal universities, working within established theoretical frameworks, had to rely on observation alone. Is the chest moving? Does Demirrah fog when held to the lips? Does the body respond to pain? Is there a pulse? The problem is that several medical conditions can produce symptoms almost indistinguishable from death to an observer without instruments. Diabetic coma, severe hypothermia, catalepsy, a condition characterized by rigidity, dramatically slowed respiration, and unresponsiveness. Certain forms of epilepsy, overdose, profound shock. A person in any of these states might appear, to a medieval physician's careful eye, entirely dead. And in a world without refrigeration, there was enormous social pressure to bury the body quickly. A corpse deteriorates. In summer, the timeline could be brutally short, sometimes 24 to 48 hours. Communities didn't have the luxury of waiting a week to be absolutely certain. Records across Europe document cases of people who woke up in their coffins, some before burial, some after. A gravedigger in the 14th century in Germany reported hearing knocking from a freshly filled grave and digging up a woman who survived, though with severe psychological trauma. Medieval chronicles mention cases of people returning from the dead, who were on investigation simply not dead in the first place. The responses to this fear were creative, earnest, and sometimes touching in their ingenuity. The safety coffin was the most elaborate solution. Wealthy families, and this was an option primarily for the wealthy, could commission coffins equipped with a string or cord attached to the finger of the deceased, threaded through a small tube running up through the coffin lid and the earth above, connected to a bell at the surface. A graveyard watchman, sometimes called a sin eater, sometimes simply a paid attendant, would sit through the night listening. If the bell rang, digging would commence immediately. This is the origin, or one claimed origin, of the phrases dead ringer and saved by the bell. Etymologists debate these specific derivations, noting that documentation is spotty and the phrases may have other roots. But the safety coffin bell itself was absolutely real, patented in multiple versions across Europe and America from the 17th through the 19th century, and sold commercially. It was not a metaphor. It was a product. People bought it. Churches in some regions established waiting mortuaries, dedicated buildings where bodies would be kept, sometimes for several days before burial. Attendants would watch for signs of movement, breathing, or change in color. The bodies were connected to alarm systems. Some waiting mortuaries were architecturally elaborate, almost comfortable in their design. Death's waiting room, hedging its bets. The Leichhardt Mortuary in Frankfurt, established in the late 18th century but reflecting practices with older medieval roots, was famous for its alarm system. Every corpse was connected by a cord to a central bell. Attendants were employed around the clock. Several resurrections were recorded there, people who showed signs of life before burial and recovered. Medical literature from the medieval and early modern period is full of debates about the exact signs of true death. Physicians argued in print about whether a corpse needed to show rigor mortis before burial was safe, whether putrefaction was the only reliable sign, whether the smell was sufficient evidence. These weren't philosophical debates, they were practical ones, driven by real cases of error. What does this tell us about medieval life, beyond its obvious horror? First, it tells us that medieval people were not passive acceptors of mystery. Faced with a terrifying problem, the possibility of waking 6 feet underground, they engineered solutions. Imperfect, expensive, sometimes absurd solutions, but solutions nonetheless. The human drive to problem solve persisted even into the grave. Second, it reveals the texture of medieval grief. Death was not clean or distant. The body stayed home. Family members washed it, dressed it, sat with it. The possibility that the person might still be in there, that the eye might flutter, the chest might rise, was not a comforting fantasy, but a genuine documented possibility. Grief in medieval Europe carried an additional, unbearable weight: uncertainty. Third, and this is the detail that should really burrow into your mind, the scratch marks. Archaeological excavations of medieval graves have occasionally found evidence of movement post-burial, the coffin lid scratched from below, the body in a different position than it was placed. These aren't supernatural, they're biological, the result of decomposition gases causing movement. But medieval people who found them didn't know that. What they believed they were seeing was evidence of premature burial, which deepened the fear, which drove more elaborate preventions, which is how a culture ends up with professional graveyard bell ringers watching through the night. Fear generates institutions. Institutions generate culture. And sometimes the fear was right.
In 1386, in the French town of Falaise, a pig was arrested. It was taken into custody, transported to the local jail, and held while the legal process ran its course. It was given a formal trial. Evidence was presented. A verdict was reached. The pig was found guilty of the murder of a child. The pig was then dressed in human clothing, a jacket, trousers, gloves, and publicly executed by hanging in the town square. The judge went home feeling that justice had been served. Animal trials were not a rare aberration in medieval Europe. They were a recognized, repeated, and legally serious phenomenon that occurred across France, Germany, Switzerland, Italy, and beyond, from roughly the 9th century through the 18th. Pigs, horses, moles, rats, weevils, locusts, dogs, bulls, cows, caterpillars, all faced judicial proceedings. Some were executed, some were acquitted, some were excommunicated by church courts, some were simply ordered to leave town. To understand why this happened, you need to understand the medieval framework of moral responsibility, which was significantly different from our own. Modern legal systems draw a clear, hard line between moral agents, beings capable of choice, intention, and therefore guilt, and non-agents, which include animals, weather, and machines. We don't put hurricanes on trial. We don't sentence landslides to prison. Non-agents cause harm, but cannot be guilty because guilt requires intention. Medieval theology drew this line differently, or rather, it sometimes didn't draw it at all. The philosophical roots run deep into scholastic theology and ancient Roman law, which both recognized animal behavior as potentially subject to moral evaluation. If an animal attacked a human, it was not merely a danger to be neutralized, it was a potential wrongdoer to be judged. The community's response needed to be not just practical, but moral and ritualistic, because the community's relationship with the cosmos depended on moral order being maintained and seen to be maintained. Criminal trials of animals followed procedures that would be recognizable in any modern court. The accused animal was formally charged. A date was set. In many cases, and this is the detail that genuinely astonishes, a defense attorney was appointed. The defense attorney argued with apparent seriousness on behalf of their client. Records survive of eloquent defenses made on behalf of pigs, including arguments about mitigating circumstances, the animal's youth, its character, and the provocation it may have received. The prosecution argued the other side. Witnesses testified. The judge deliberated. A verdict was rendered. In criminal cases involving individual animals, usually pigs or dogs, execution was the typical sentence. The execution was often carried out with the same ceremony used for human criminals. The animal might be dressed, paraded through town, and hanged or burned in a public space. The spectacle served the same function as human public execution. It demonstrated the community's commitment to moral order and provided a visible communal catharsis. But there was a second category of animal trial that operated through church courts rather than civil courts, and these involved not individual animals, but entire species. Rats that infested grain stores, weevils that destroyed vineyards, caterpillars that decimated crops, moles that undermined fields. These creatures could not be individually arrested, obviously. Instead, the church issued summonses to the species collectively, ordering them to appear before the ecclesiastical court, which, naturally, they did not attend. This absence was noted in the record. A defense attorney was still appointed to represent their interests and argue for leniency or accommodation. One famous defense argued that the insects had been created before humans had sinned, and therefore had a prior claim to the land. A surprisingly sophisticated environmental argument made on behalf of caterpillars in 16th century France. If found guilty, which they usually were, the church would issue a sentence of excommunication or banishment. An official church decree, read publicly, ordered the creatures to leave the affected area. Sometimes this was accompanied by specific geographic designations. The insects were assigned a particular stretch of land outside the community, where they could live without interference. Did this work? Occasionally, in the sense that pest populations naturally fluctuate, and when they declined after a church decree, this was recorded as evidence of its efficacy. When they didn't decline, more proceedings were initiated. The philosophical machinery underlying all of this was the medieval great chain of being. the hierarchical ordering of all creation from God at the top down through angels, humans, animals, plants, and minerals. Within this framework, every tier of creation had responsibilities and was subject to the moral order governing the whole. Animals weren't outside the system, they were in it. There was also a deeply practical community function these trials served. When your entire harvest is destroyed by insects, your family faces starvation. The psychological need to do something, anything, in response to catastrophe is powerful and universal. The trial gave form to that need. It said, we are not passive victims. We are moral agents in a moral universe, and we are responding appropriately to a wrong. The last documented animal trial in Europe occurred in Switzerland in 1906, when a dog was tried and executed as an accomplice in a robbery and murder. That's not medieval. That's within living memory of people who were alive when the first airplane flew. The story of animal trials is not a story of medieval stupidity. It's a story of what happens when a civilization builds an elaborate and comprehensive moral framework and then applies it with absolute consistency. If everything is subject to moral law, then everything can be judged. The medieval mind was, in its way, admirably thorough.
You wake up with a fever. You're sweating, shaking, confused. You send for the doctor. The doctor arrives, examines you carefully, and makes his professional recommendation. He's going to drain some blood out of you. Not a little, potentially a lot. He'll cut open a vein near your elbow and let it run into a bowl, checking the color and consistency as it flows. When he's taken enough, and enough is a judgment call, he'll bandage you up and tell you to rest. If you get better, it's because of the bloodletting. If you get worse, it's because he didn't take enough. Bloodletting, the deliberate removal of blood from the body as a medical treatment, is probably the most consequential wrong idea in the history of medicine. It was practiced for approximately 2,000 years across multiple civilizations, endorsed by the greatest medical minds of each era, and killed an unknown but certainly enormous number of people who might otherwise have recovered. And it made complete sense within the theoretical framework of the people who practiced it. The foundation was Galenic medicine, developed by the Greek physician Galen in the 2nd century CE, and refined over centuries into a comprehensive system that dominated Western medical thinking through the medieval period and well into the Renaissance. At its center was the theory of 4 humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. These 4 substances were thought to circulate through the body in various proportions, and health was defined as their proper balance. Illness, any illness, resulted from an imbalance, an excess or deficiency of one or more humors. Different seasons, climates, foods, activities, and emotions affected humoral balance. A hot summer could produce excess blood. A cold winter might cause excess phlegm. Anxiety generated yellow bile. Grief, black bile. The physician's task was to restore balance through diet, lifestyle, and, crucially, intervention. Bloodletting addressed excess blood directly by removing it, but it was also used for conditions we wouldn't associate with excess blood at all: fevers, headaches, pleurisy, inflammation, melancholy, mania, insomnia, epilepsy, plague. The logic was that blood, being the dominant humor, could produce secondary imbalances in others, and its reduction had cascading beneficial effects throughout the system. The tools of bloodletting were specific and refined over centuries. The lancet, a small pointed blade, was used to open veins, usually at the elbow, the antecubital vein which we still use for blood draws today, the neck, behind the ear, under the tongue, or in the foot, depending on which organ the physician was trying to affect. Medieval medical literature included detailed charts mapping relationships between specific veins and specific organs. Cut this vein to treat the liver, that one to address the lungs. The amount of blood removed varied widely and was the subject of genuine medical debate. Some physicians favored small amounts taken regularly. Others, particularly for acute conditions, favored aggressive removal of large quantities. A patient with a high fever might have 1 to 2 pints of blood removed in a session, sometimes more. Leeches were the more elegant alternative, considered more precise and controllable than the lancet. The medicinal leech, Hirudo medicinalis, was a cottage industry across Europe. Leech ponds were maintained by physicians and monasteries. Cities had leech cellars. A physician's professional kit included leech storage vessels. The leech was applied to the skin, allowed to feed until full, and then removed or allowed to drop off naturally. The monastery was in fact a major center of bloodletting practice. Monastic schedules included regular bloodletting as a health maintenance procedure, not just for illness, but as preventive care, the way we might think about exercise or dietary management. Monks bled seasonally, in spring and autumn, to reset their humoral balance. The procedure was so normalized in monastic life that there were dedicated recovery rooms, the infirmarium, where monks could rest for several days after being bled before returning to their duties. Barber surgeons, a profession that combined shaving, haircuts, dentistry, and surgery, performed most bloodletting for ordinary people who couldn't afford physicians. The barber's pole, still used today as a symbol, represents the white and red bandages used in these procedures, red for blood, white for the tourniquet. Medieval people walked past this symbol every day without finding it alarming, the same way we walk past pharmacy crosses. The practice was not confined to the uneducated. University-trained physicians bled their patients. Royal courts had bloodletting schedules. The most medically sophisticated people in Europe believed completely in its efficacy. The case of George Washington, while technically post-medieval, 1799, illustrates the stakes with terrible clarity. Washington developed what was likely acute epiglottitis, a bacterial infection of the throat, and his 3 attending physicians, all formally trained, agreed that aggressive bloodletting was the appropriate treatment. Over the course of approximately 12 hours, they removed an estimated 5 to 7 pints of blood, nearly half his total blood volume. Washington died. Many historians believe the bloodletting killed him faster and more certainly than the infection would have. Why did bloodletting persist for 2,000 years? Because the feedback mechanisms were broken. When a patient recovered after bloodletting, the treatment received credit. When they died, other factors were blamed. The disease was too advanced, not enough blood was taken, the wrong vein was opened. The treatment was unfalsifiable within its own framework. Without controlled experiments, a concept that didn't exist in medical practice until the 19th century, there was no way to compare patients who received bloodletting against those who didn't. Individual physicians might notice that their bled patients didn't consistently do better than unbled patients, but without statistical tools to analyze that observation across large populations, the pattern was invisible. The physician Pierre Louis in the 1830s finally conducted what was essentially the first clinical trial comparing bled and unbled patients with pneumonia. His results, showing no benefit and possible harm from bloodletting, were published and debated. The practice declined in the following decades. 2,000 years. Every generation produced brilliant physicians who worked within the same wrong framework, refined it, elaborated it, and passed it on. The lesson isn't that they were fools, it's that intelligence is not a sufficient protection from systematic error. You need methodology, you need controlled comparison, you need the intellectual humility to test your assumptions against reality rather than against theory.
Bloodletting is what medicine looks like without the scientific method. It is spectacular, internally consistent, widely endorsed, and catastrophically, persistently deadly.
There's a body in the main room of the house. It has been there for 3 days. Family members eat their meals nearby. Children play in the same space. Neighbors come and go, paying their respects. Life continues fully and normally around the corpse of someone who 72 hours ago was alive. This is not a horror scene. This is Tuesday in medieval Europe. Modern death is almost entirely outsourced. We die in hospitals. Our bodies are collected by funeral homes. Professionals prepare them in dedicated facilities using embalming chemicals and equipment that didn't exist for most of human history. The body is then displayed in a purpose-built space, a funeral parlor, for a defined, brief period before being transported to a cemetery that is deliberately placed away from residential areas, visited on holidays and anniversaries, and otherwise kept separate from daily life. This arrangement, death as a specialized, professional, geographically separate function, is extremely recent. For most of human history, and specifically throughout medieval Europe, death happened at home and stayed there. When a person died in a medieval household, the body remained in the home for the duration of the pre-burial period, which typically ranged from 1 to 3 days, depending on season, wealth, and local custom. The body was washed, usually by women, wives, daughters, female neighbors, who had been taught the procedures by the women before them. The body was dressed in burial clothes, sometimes the person's best outfit, sometimes a simple shroud. It was placed on a board or a bed in the main room of the house, sometimes with candles placed around it to provide light and, some believed, to ward off evil spirits. Life continued around the body. Meals were prepared and eaten. Children were present. Neighbors visited continuously. This visitation was a social obligation, a mark of community solidarity, and failure to visit was noted and criticized. The house became a social space centered on the dead, which sounds strange until you realize that in a world of high mortality and deep religious faith, the dead were never entirely separate from the living. The Church provided the theological framework for this intimacy. The soul had recently departed the body, but it hadn't gone far. It was in a state of transition, moving through the judgment process, potentially in purgatory, a concept that developed through the medieval period and was fully elaborated by the 13th century. Prayer for the dead had real effect. The living and the dead remained in relationship, and the physical body, the vehicle the soul had inhabited, deserved dignity, attention, and community witness. The graveyard itself reflected this philosophy of proximity. Medieval graveyards were located directly adjacent to, or in some cases underneath, churches. This was intentional theology. The dead rested in the shadow of the house of God, waiting for resurrection. The churchyard and the church were a unified sacred complex. Burials happened within steps of the building where the community gathered every Sunday. In crowded urban areas, this proximity created practical problems. The churchyard of Saints Innocents in Paris became one of the most notorious examples. For approximately 9 centuries, this relatively small cemetery served as the primary burial ground for much of the city. By the end of the medieval period, the soil had absorbed so many bodies that new graves had to be dug into layers of older remains.
Bones were exhumed from older graves to make room for new ones and piled into charnel houses, dedicated structures for storing cleaned bones that lined the cemetery walls. And here is the fact that most profoundly illustrates medieval attitudes toward death. The charnel house at Saints' Innocents was a public space. People walked through it. Merchants set up stalls in the arcades around the cemetery. The walls lined with skulls and bones were background to ordinary commercial activity. Food sold, deals struck, gossip exchanged. Parisians picnicked in the shadow of stacked bones. The charnel house was not hidden away. It was architectural, often beautifully designed. Bones were sometimes arranged in decorative patterns. The Sedlec ossuary in Bohemia, which still exists and can be visited today, features chandeliers made from human bones, garlands of skulls, and ornate decorative arrangements that are simultaneously ghoulish and genuinely artistic. This was not considered disturbing by medieval standards. It was considered devotional. The bones were reminders of mortality, and mortality was the central fact of Christian life. The memento mori tradition, Latin for remember you will die, was a genuine and pervasive philosophy, not a dark aesthetic. Skulls appeared in paintings, in jewelry, in church decoration, in illuminated manuscripts. Wealthy patrons commissioned portraits that included skulls prominently in the frame. This was not morbid exhibitionism. It was theological instruction. Hold your earthly life lightly, because it ends. Focus on the eternal. The dance macabre, the dance of death, was one of the most popular artistic themes of the late medieval period, particularly following the Black Death. In these images and performances, skeletal death figures lead chains of humans in a dance. Pope, emperor, merchant, peasant, child, all equal, all destined for the same end. These images were displayed publicly on church walls, on printed broadsheets, in illustrated books. Children saw them regularly. They were not meant to terrorize, but to instruct. The practical consequences of all this intimacy with death was that medieval people had an emotional relationship with mortality that modern people simply do not have. Death was not abstract or distant. It was in the room. It was at the dinner table. It was in the churchyard where you walked every Sunday. Grief was real and profound. Medieval literature is full of laments for the dead that are as raw and human as anything written today. But it operated in a different context, one where death was woven into the texture of ordinary life. What we have gained by separating death from daily life is a certain comfort, a removal of constant confrontation with mortality. What we have lost is harder to name, perhaps a kind of honest reckoning with impermanence, a familiarity with the full arc of human experience that comes from being present with it rather than outsourcing it to professionals. Medieval people knew in their bones and their daily lives that they would die. They organized their world accordingly.
Your crops have failed 2 years in a row. Your youngest child died of a fever last winter. Your neighbor's cow gave blood instead of milk for a week. You have watched your community suffer inexplicable misfortune, and you need an explanation that makes sense of it. Someone is responsible, and you think you know who it might be. The witch trial craze is one of history's most studied and most misunderstood episodes. Commonly associated with Salem, Massachusetts in 1692, it is actually a primarily European phenomenon that peaked between 1450 and 1750, involved an estimated 40,000 to 60,000 executions, with some estimates significantly higher, and touched virtually every country in Europe, from Scotland to Sweden, from Spain to Poland. It was not a medieval aberration. It peaked in the early modern period, well into the Renaissance, overlapping with the scientific revolution, the printing press, and the Reformation. The most intense witch hunting occurred not in the darkest years of the Middle Ages, but in the centuries of transition toward modernity. That is important. Remember it. The theological and legal infrastructure for witch hunting developed gradually. Belief in witchcraft, in people who used magical means to cause harm, was ancient and widespread. But the specific framework of the witch trial required several components to come together. First, a theological definition of witchcraft as a pact with the devil, not just folk magic, but a heretical alignment with Satan. Second, a legal mechanism for prosecuting it. Third, a cultural panic sufficient to generate accusations in volume. The Malleus Maleficarium, the Hammer of Witches, published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer, a Dominican friar, provided the theoretical and procedural framework. It described how to identify witches, how to interrogate them, how to extract confessions, and how to prosecute them. It was deeply misogynistic. Kramer believed women were disproportionately susceptible to diabolical influence due to their weaker moral nature. The book was initially rejected by church authorities, who found Kramer's methods troubling. He published it anyway, with a forged endorsement letter that made it appear church-approved. The Malleus became a bestseller. It went through multiple editions and printings. For several decades, it was the second most printed book in Europe after the Bible. It circulated among inquisitors, judges, clergy, and educated laypeople. It standardized witch hunting procedure across different jurisdictions and gave the enterprise an air of scholarly rigor. Witch identification had its own grotesque methodology. The witch's mark, a spot on the body believed to be insensitive to pain where the devil had pressed his finger, was searched for by prickers, specialists who jabbed needles into the accused's skin looking for numb spots. This was, of course, wildly unreliable. People have naturally varying pain sensitivity, and prickers could fake results easily. Some were later revealed to have been using retractable needles that could create the appearance of deep insertion without penetrating the skin. Swimming tests, a descendant of the water ordeal, were used to test witches. The accused was thrown into water, sometimes bound, sometimes free, and their floating or sinking evaluated as evidence. The theological logic was that water, associated with baptism, would reject a witch. Floating, guilty; sinking, innocent. The obvious problem was unchanged from its medieval predecessor. Sleep deprivation was used extensively. An accused witch might be kept awake for days by guards who walked them continuously, preventing sleep until they confessed. Sleep deprivation at this level produces hallucinations, cognitive disintegration, and a desperate willingness to say anything, including self-incriminating confessions to crimes that never occurred. The social dynamics of witch accusations are as revealing as the legal procedures. Historians who've analyzed accusation records find consistent patterns. The accused were disproportionately women, roughly 70 to 80%, varying by region and period. They were often elderly, widowed, or otherwise socially marginalized, people with limited community power or support networks. They were sometimes involved in disputes with neighbors. Accusations often followed conflicts over property, livestock, debts, or personal slights. The accusation was, in some cases, a weapon wielded in ordinary community conflict. But it would be wrong to reduce all witch accusations to cynical manipulation. Many accusers believed sincerely. In a world where disease, crop failure, and infant death were constant and inexplicable, the concept of malevolent magical causation provided a coherent explanatory framework. If your child sickened and died after a quarrel with the woman down the road, and you believed witchcraft was real and active in the world, connecting these events was not irrational within your framework. It was pattern recognition, the same cognitive process that underlies all human sense-making applied to a false premise. The witch trial craze was in part a collective response to collective trauma. The Black Death had killed a third of Europe's population.
economic disruption, religious conflict, first between Catholics and heretics, then between Catholics and Protestants, and climatic deterioration known as the Little Ice Age, which produced crop failures across the continent, created a sustained atmosphere of anxiety, loss, and the need to explain catastrophe. Witch hunting provided answers and targets. The end of mass witch hunting came gradually and unevenly. Skeptics appeared within the tradition itself. People who questioned the reliability of torture-induced confessions, the consistency of witch-marking evidence, the procedural fairness of the trials. Friedrich Spee, a Jesuit priest who served as confessor to condemned witches in Germany in the 1620s, wrote a devastating critique of witch trial procedure, noting that the system was designed to produce confessions regardless of actual guilt, that was published anonymously and circulated widely. Enlightenment philosophy, with its emphasis on evidence, reason, and skepticism of supernatural causation, ultimately dismantled the intellectual framework that had made witch trials possible. The last major legal execution for witchcraft in Western Europe occurred in Switzerland in 1782. What the witch trial craze teaches us, its most enduring and uncomfortable lesson, is that mass persecution does not require individual malice. It requires a shared framework that assigns blame to a category of people, institutions willing to formalize that assignment, and social conditions desperate enough to make the framework appealing. Those conditions are not unique to the Middle Ages.
It's a public holiday. The whole town is here. Men, women, children, elderly. Vendors are selling food and drink. People have saved good spots, arrived early to claim their viewing position. There's a festive atmosphere, a sense of shared anticipation. What they're all here to watch is a man being hanged, drawn, and quartered in the town square. Public execution in medieval Europe was not a grim, reluctant necessity performed quietly and quickly by a state uncomfortable with its own violence. It was a spectacle, a performance, a civic event designed to be witnessed by the maximum number of people, experienced as a collective, and remembered long afterward. The crowd was not incidental to the execution. The crowd was the point. To understand this, you need to understand the medieval theory of punishment, which was fundamentally different from modern penal philosophy. Modern criminal justice systems operate, at least in theory, with rehabilitation as one of their goals. We also speak of deterrence, incapacitation, and proportionate punishment, but there is an underlying assumption that criminals are social products who can potentially be redirected, reformed, returned to society. The prison, in theory, is where this happens. Medieval punishment had no such theory. Rehabilitation as a concept didn't exist in secular criminal justice. The goals of punishment were retribution, a wrong demands a proportionate wrong in response, deterrence, make the punishment visible and terrible enough that others are discouraged, and social or cosmic restoration. A wrong has disturbed the moral order. Visible punishment restores it. All three goals were best served by maximum public visibility. The execution had to be seen. It had to be witnessed. An execution performed in private defeated the entire purpose. Execution sites were therefore placed prominently. In London, Tyburn, the primary execution site, was located at what is now Marble Arch, at the edge of Hyde Park, easily accessible from the city center. The permanent gallows there, known as the Tyburn Tree, was a triangular structure capable of hanging multiple people simultaneously. Execution days at Tyburn drew crowds estimated at tens of thousands. Grandstands were built nearby and rented out to spectators willing to pay for a better view. Wealthy observers could afford private boxes with unobstructed sightlines,
much as theatergoers paid for better seats. The journey to the execution site, the cart procession through the streets, the condemned in the back while crowds gathered along the route, was itself part of the spectacle. Crowds might jeer, throw things, or if the condemned was popular, cheer, weep, or press forward to offer last drinks from taverns along the route. The condemned were expected to perform in this procession, to demonstrate appropriate demeanor, contrition, or defiance, depending on the role they were playing in the community's moral theater. The scaffold speech was an established genre. The condemned was given the opportunity, the platform, and the expectation to address the crowd from the scaffold before their death. A well-executed scaffold speech could make a condemned person famous. Accounts were published as pamphlets and sold throughout the city. People debated the quality of different criminals' final speeches. Did they show proper remorse? Did they maintain innocence convincingly? Did they die bravely? These were aesthetic and moral assessments that the community made collectively. The highest category of execution, reserved for those convicted of high treason, which meant crimes against the crown or the fundamental order of the state, was hanging, drawing, and quartering. The procedure in full was the condemned was hanged by the neck, but not until dead, taken down while still living. They were then drawn, their abdomen opened and their intestines removed, sometimes burned before their eyes. Then they were beheaded and the body cut into 4 parts. The head and quarters were then distributed to different locations, gates, bridges, prominent buildings, and displayed on spikes as a public warning. In London, the heads on London Bridge were a long-standing and notable feature of the city's skyline, visible to all who crossed the Thames. This was not sadism for its own sake, or at least that is not its primary explanation. The deliberate destruction of the body carried specific theological weight. Medieval Christians believed in bodily resurrection, that at the Last Judgment, the physical body would be restored and reunited with the soul. Destroying the body and scattering it was therefore an attack on the condemned's eternal prospects, an additional punishment extending beyond death. It was the most complete expression of the state's power, not just death, but potentially damning the soul to a compromised resurrection. Execution broadsheets, printed accounts of notable executions, including physical descriptions, scaffold speeches, confessions, and moral commentary, were one of the most popular forms of print media from the invention of the printing press onward. They were functionally tabloids. The public consumed them eagerly. Certain executions, particularly those involving famous criminals, controversial verdicts, or spectacular methods, became cultural events discussed months afterward. Children attended executions routinely, taken by their parents as a matter of course. This wasn't considered harmful or inappropriate. It was civic education. Showing children the consequences of crime was considered responsible parenting, an obligation to prepare them for the moral realities of community life. Children who watched hangings were being taught in the most direct possible way that the community enforced its rules, and that violations had visible, irreversible public consequences. The last public execution in England took place in 1868, when Michael Barrett was hanged outside Newgate Prison before a crowd of thousands. The next week, executions were moved behind prison walls. The decision was not primarily humanitarian, though reform advocates had argued on humanitarian grounds for years. It was partly about disorder. Public executions had become occasions for crowds that were difficult to manage, and the festive atmosphere was considered by some authorities to undercut the deterrent message. Death, it seemed, needed a more controlled environment. What the medieval public execution reveals most fundamentally is that punishment is always theater, always a performance of values, power, and communal identity. Modern punishment is also theater, just performed before smaller and more carefully selected audiences. The medieval city staged its moral drama in the open air, with the whole community as audience and participant. We have moved the stage indoors. The drama continues.
The medieval feast looks spectacular from the painting. An enormous table groaning with roasted meats, elaborate pies, colorful sauces, towering decorations, lords and ladies in fine clothes, musicians playing in the gallery, candles everywhere. Magnificent. Now get closer. Smell the meat. Ask what's in the sauce. Find out how long that bird has been sitting there. Your appetite may not survive the investigation. Medieval food culture is frequently romanticized into something picturesque: hearty peasant stews, noble feasts, spiced wines by candlelight. The reality was shaped by constraints that modern people have almost entirely escaped. No refrigeration, no understanding of bacterial contamination, no global supply chains, and a social hierarchy so rigid that what you ate announced your place in the universe with every meal. The most fundamental challenge was preservation. In a world without refrigeration, any food that couldn't be eaten immediately had to be preserved by other means. The primary methods were drying, smoking, salting, pickling, and fermentation. Each method worked, more or less, but none fully prevented degradation. They slowed it. And in a world where meat was expensive, wasting it because it had begun to turn was not an option for most people. High meat, meat that had aged well past what modern food safety standards would permit, was eaten regularly across all social classes, though it was experienced differently at different levels of the social hierarchy. For the poor, it was necessity. For the wealthy, it was sometimes considered a delicacy, a mark of sophisticated palate that could appreciate subtle and not so subtle flavors unavailable in fresh meat. Medieval culinary literature describes aging and preparation techniques for meat that would today require a biohazard warning. Spices were the answer to everything, and by spices we mean quantities of pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, saffron, and cardamom that would strike a modern cook as wildly excessive. Medieval recipes call for spices in amounts that would completely overwhelm the flavor of the underlying ingredient by modern standards. Historians have debated whether this was primarily to mask the taste of degraded meat, or whether medieval people simply had genuinely different flavor preferences, or both. The answer is probably both, in proportions that varied by recipe and context. Pepper was among the most valuable commodities in medieval Europe, at various points literally worth its weight in silver. Rents were paid in pepper. Saffron, the most expensive spice still used today, was valued so highly that adulterating it with cheaper substitutes was punishable by death in some German cities. The Saffronschau Code of Nuremberg prescribed burning for saffron adulterers. The spice trade was one of the primary economic engines of medieval commerce, driving the exploration that eventually produced the European discovery of the Americas, all because food went bad. The food hierarchy was as elaborate and carefully maintained as the social hierarchy it reflected. At the top, white bread, made from finely milled wheat flour. White bread was expensive to produce. The milling and sifting required to remove the bran and germ was labor-intensive, and so it served as a visible marker of status. Lords ate white bread. The further down the social scale, the darker and coarser the bread, produced from less refined flour, often mixed with rye, barley, or even peas in times of scarcity. Servants ate the heels and crusts. The poor ate what was left. At formal medieval feasts, this hierarchy was architecturally encoded in the meal service itself. The high table, literally elevated on a dais, received the best food, the finest cuts, the most elaborate preparations. As you moved away from the high table toward the lower tables and eventually the doors, food quality declined visibly. Everyone in the room could see who was getting what. The feast was a three-dimensional diagram of social structure, edible and consumed in public.
The subtlety was among the most bizarre features of elite medieval dining. Between the major courses of a grand feast, not instead of them but in addition to them, elaborate sculptural confections made of sugar, marzipan, or similar materials would be presented to the diners. These were not primarily for eating, they were for admiration. A subtlety might take the form of a castle with working drawbridge, a religious scene, a ship in full sail, an animal, or a heraldic device, all rendered in meticulous detail in colored sugar. After suitable admiration, the subtlety might be distributed and eaten, or it might simply be taken away. The point was the display, the craftsmanship, and the demonstration of the host's wealth and imagination. Medieval table service inverted modern expectations in another way, the coffin. This is not the burial vessel, but the culinary term for a thick, stiff pastry case, used as a cooking and serving vessel for meat fillings. The coffin was not meant to be eaten. Its purpose was structural, a container that could hold the filling together during cooking and service. The pastry was often quite dense, sometimes seasoned with fat and salt, but its texture after cooking was tough enough that it functioned more like a dish than a food. The filling was eaten. The coffin was frequently discarded or given to servants and the poor. In a world of food scarcity, you were making a cooking container out of what was elsewhere a staple food. This was conspicuous consumption encoded in wheat. Bread itself had another role, the trencher. At lower levels of the feast, diners received a thick slice of old, stale bread that served as a plate. Food was placed on it, the bread absorbing juices and sauces throughout the meal. At the end, the trencher, now soaked and flavored, might be eaten by the diner, given to a servant, or thrown to dogs. It was a disposable plate that was also food, and sometimes also furniture. Multiple trenchers stacked and placed under dishes served to elevate presentation while solving a functional problem. Medieval cooking techniques also produced results that would disturb modern sensibilities around food safety. The great fireplaces of manor kitchens operated at inconsistent temperatures. Meat was often added to a continuous simmering pot, a stock pot that might not be fully emptied for days, with new material added as old material was consumed. The perpetual stew, sometimes called pottage in simpler forms, was a genuine feature of medieval kitchens at multiple social levels. Modern food safety standards require refrigeration and reheating to specific temperatures that kill bacteria. A medieval perpetual stew, kept continuously but perhaps not vigorously warm, was a bacterial culture of significant complexity. And yet, people survived it. Medieval people developed robust gut microbiomes adapted to their food environment. Food poisoning certainly occurred. Medieval medical literature describes symptoms we'd recognize, but the population adapted to its food supply over generations, developing tolerances and immune responses that modern people, raised in a sanitized food environment, probably lack. What medieval food culture ultimately demonstrates is that eating is never merely biological. It is social, theatrical, hierarchical, and ideological. Medieval people knew this explicitly and built it into every aspect of their food systems, from the color of the bread to the shape of the plate, to the distance of your table from the Lord's. Every meal was a performance of identity. They just happened to perform it with meat that was occasionally green.
Look at this medieval painting. There's a child in it. You can tell by the size. But look at the face. Adult proportions. Adult expression. Adult clothing, just smaller. No baby fat, no childhood softness, no distinguishing features of youth except height. Medieval artists were not bad at anatomy. They were accurately representing something real. In their world, children were not a distinct category of human being. They were just small adults. The concept of childhood, the idea that the years between birth and adulthood constitute a distinct developmental stage deserving special protection, dedicated institutions, and a fundamentally different set of expectations and experiences, is historically recent. The French historian Philippe Arras made this argument in his landmark work Centuries of Childhood, and while subsequent historians have debated his specific claims and their extent, the broad direction of his thesis has been validated.
The protected, institutionally recognized childhood of the modern West is a product of early modernity and industrial-era reform, not a universal feature of human society. In medieval Europe, children became economically useful, and were expected to be, as early as their bodies allowed. The age varied by task and class. Children of the laboring poor might begin contributing to agricultural work at 5 or 6. Scaring birds from crops was a classic child's job, requiring nothing but mobility and noise. By 8 or 9, children were capable of more substantial agricultural tasks. By their early teens, children in laboring families were doing adult work for adult hours. The apprenticeship system formalized this transition. Boys, and sometimes girls in certain trades, could be apprenticed to a master craftsman as young as 7, though the more common starting age was 10 to 12. An apprenticeship typically lasted 7 years, during which the apprentice lived in the master's household, worked for no wage, though they received room, board, and training, and gradually acquired the skills of the trade. By the end of the apprenticeship, at roughly 17 to 19 years old, the young person was a journeyman, fully skilled, able to work for wages, functionally adult by every social measure. For the children of nobility and the upper classes, the path was different, but equally early in its transition to adult responsibility. Noble boys were sent to other noble households as pages at age 7, sometimes younger. This was not punishment, but education. The page served the lord of the household, learning etiquette, horsemanship, and the basics of noble conduct through service and observation. By 14, a page might become a squire, assisting a knight directly and beginning martial training. Knighthood, full adult warrior status, came at roughly 21 years old, but the transition to adult social roles began at 7. Noble girls were educated in similar households or in convents, learning the management of a noble household, needlework, music, reading, though literacy rates varied widely, and the social graces required of a wife in their social class. Their transition to adult status was marked not by knighthood or craft mastery, but by marriage. Child marriage is perhaps the most difficult medieval practice for modern sensibilities to process, and it's important to be precise about what it meant and what it didn't mean. Betrothal, formal engagement, could occur in infancy, particularly for children of the nobility and royalty, for whom marriage alliances were diplomatic and economic instruments of the highest importance. A king might betroth his 3-year-old daughter to a 6-year-old foreign prince to cement a peace treaty. But betrothal was not marriage, and marriage was not necessarily consummation. Canon law, church law, established minimum ages for marriage, 12 for girls, 14 for boys, grounded in the incorrect medical theory that these ages represented puberty for each sex. Consummation was typically expected to be delayed until the parties were physically mature. In practice, enforcement was uneven, and girls from politically important families were sometimes pressured into fully adult marital roles before they were physically ready. For ordinary people, the peasants and urban laborers who constituted the vast majority of the population, child marriage was less common. Economic constraints limited early marriage. Young couples needed to be able to establish a household, which required accumulated resources. The average age at first marriage for ordinary people in medieval England, based on surviving records, was actually quite close to modern norms, mid to late 20s for men, early to mid-20s for women. This is one of the ways in which popular imagination of medieval life is significantly wrong. The high infant and child mortality rates of medieval Europe, estimates suggest that between 30 and 50% of children died before reaching adulthood, with the first 5 years being the most dangerous, shaped emotional relationships with childhood in complex ways. Medieval people loved their children.
This is abundantly documented in literature, letters, and legal records, which show parents grieving, advocating for, and sacrificing for their children's welfare. The idea that high mortality produced emotional detachment, that medieval parents didn't bond closely with children because so many died, is a myth thoroughly debunked by historians. But constant exposure to childhood death did create a different emotional architecture around that grief. Medieval people were not more callous than modern people. They were more familiar with loss, and familiarity over generations produces different emotional frameworks for processing it. Death was close, routine, and theologically contextualized. A child who died was understood to have passed to God's care, with prayers and intercession available to ease their passage. This theological framework provided support that secular modern grief often lacks, while simultaneously framing the loss in ways that might seem strange or cold by contemporary standards. What the absence of modern childhood also meant was the absence of the institutions we associate with it. Compulsory education, the idea that children should spend their formative years in formal school rather than working, didn't exist until the 19th century in most of the Western world. Pediatric medicine, a specialized branch dedicated to children's unique medical needs, is also a modern development. Medieval physicians treated children as small adults, using the same therapeutic approaches with adjusted doses. Child psychology, child development theory, developmental milestones, stages of cognitive and emotional growth, all of these are modern inventions. The medieval child moved from infancy to social productivity with relatively little intermediate space, shaped by family, by work, by the church, and by the example of the adults around them, without the protected developmental period we now consider not just normal, but morally required. Whether modern childhood is better for children is mostly obvious. Higher survival rates, more education, longer developmental time before adult responsibilities. But whether it is better in all respects is a more interesting question. Medieval children who survived to adulthood entered it with skills, responsibilities, and social roles that gave them identity and purpose. The extended dependency of modern adolescence is its own form of challenge. The medieval child had at least a clear path forward, and they started walking it early.
In 1347, a fleet of trading ships arrived at the Sicilian port of Messina. The ships were carrying cloth, spices, and something else. When port officials boarded the vessels, most of the crew were dead. The few still living were covered in black, oozing swellings the size of eggs, oozing blood and pus. They were burning with fever, delirious, dying. The ships were ordered out of the harbor immediately. It was too late. The Black Death, caused by the bacterium Yersinia pestis, transmitted primarily by fleas carried on rats, but also spreading in pneumonic form directly between humans through respiratory droplets, killed an estimated 30 to 60% of Europe's total population between 1347 and 1351. In some regions, the mortality was higher. Parts of Italy lost 60 to 70% of their inhabitants. Some towns were virtually emptied. Florence, one of the most sophisticated cities in Europe, lost perhaps half its population in a single year. To put this in contemporary terms, imagine a disease arriving in the United States today that killed between 100 and 200 million people in 4 years. Then imagine that disease returning repeatedly every decade or two for the next century. That is the scale of what medieval Europe experienced. The epidemic that arrived in 1347 was not the end. It was the beginning of a plague era. Major outbreaks recurred in the 1360s, 1370s, 1380s, and periodically throughout the 15th century. No generation that lived through the initial outbreak lived to see a Europe that had fully recovered. Entire demographic structures were disrupted. Villages were abandoned. Languages changed as populations shifted.
The relationship between labor and capital transformed as the sudden scarcity of workers gave surviving peasants unprecedented bargaining leverage. The medical and intellectual response to the Black Death is a case study in what happens when an explanatory framework meets an event it cannot adequately explain. Medieval medicine, operating within the Galenic-humoral framework, understood disease as internal imbalance, potentially triggered by external factors including air quality. The concept of miasma, corrupted or poisonous air arising from rotting organic matter, swamps, or celestial causes, was the dominant theory of epidemic disease causation. When a disease struck quickly, killed widely, and seemed to spread through communities without obvious physical contact, miasma was the most coherent available explanation. The medical faculty of the University of Paris, arguably the most prestigious medical institution in Europe, was asked by the French king to investigate the cause of the epidemic. In 1348, they issued their official report. The cause, they determined, was a triple conjunction of Saturn, Jupiter, and Mars in the sign of Aquarius that had occurred at 1 p.m. on March 20th, 1345. This alignment had heated and corrupted the atmosphere, drawing noxious vapors from the earth and sea, producing the epidemic. This was not negligence or laziness. It was the best available scientific thinking applied with genuine rigor to an impossible problem. Medieval medical theory explicitly connected celestial configurations to atmospheric conditions and human health. The Parisian faculty had consulted their best sources, applied their most sophisticated analytical tools, and produced an answer. The answer was wrong, but the methodology was sincere. Practical recommendations followed from the theory. Avoid bad air. Don't be near swamps, open graves, or rotting matter. Burn aromatic herbs and wood to purify the air. Carry nosegays of flowers. Avoid bathing. Opening the pores was thought to admit corrupted air into the body more easily. Avoid strenuous exercise and sexual activity. Maintain moderate diets and emotions. These recommendations weren't random, they followed logically from the miasma theory. They also happened to not work. The social responses to the Black Death were as extreme as the mortality rates. The flagellant movement, already existing as a minor devotional practice, erupted into a mass phenomenon in 1348 to 1349. Groups of men traveled from town to town, publicly whipping themselves with leather straps embedded with metal points, drawing blood, while singing hymns and performing liturgy. Their theology held that the plague was God's punishment for collective human sin, and that voluntary suffering might appease divine wrath, shortcutting the epidemic. The flagellants attracted huge crowds, community support, donations, and participation wherever they went. People genuinely believed this ritual suffering was an effective response to the plague. Pope Clement VI, watching the movement grow in size and increasingly heterodox theological direction, eventually condemned it and suppressed it in 1349. But for approximately a year, large bands of self-flagellating penitents moved through European cities while those cities were simultaneously dying of plague. The scapegoating of Jewish communities was the Black Death's most catastrophic social consequence. Accusations spread rapidly across Europe that Jews had caused the plague by poisoning wells, an accusation with no basis in fact, logically incoherent, Jewish communities died of plague at similar rates, and theologically convenient for communities looking for agents of destruction. In the years 1348 to 1351, Jewish communities were massacred in over 200 European cities. In Strasbourg, around 2,000 Jews were burned alive in a cemetery in February 1349, months before the plague had even reached the city. The persecution was preemptive, a pogrom conducted against a threat that hadn't arrived yet. Pope Clement VI twice issued papal bulls condemning the violence and explicitly stating that Jews were not responsible for the plague. The bulls had limited effect. Fear and hatred did not respond to papal logic.
The long-term consequences of the Black Death reshaped European history in ways still visible today. The sudden labor scarcity that followed massive mortality shifted power relations between lords and peasants, accelerating the decline of feudal serfdom in Western Europe. Peasants who survived could demand higher wages, refuse unfavorable contracts, migrate to better situations. The mechanisms of feudal control, tied as they were to labor surpluses, broke down rapidly when there weren't enough workers to coerce. The Church, which had positioned itself as the mediator between humanity and divine judgment, lost credibility when its prayers, its sacraments, and its clergy died alongside everyone else. Priests died in huge numbers. They were in constant contact with the sick and dying. The clergy who replaced them were often hastily trained, poorly educated, and of questionable character, since the Church needed bodies in parishes desperately. Public confidence in ecclesiastical authority declined in ways that would eventually, over the next century and a half, contribute to the conditions that made the Protestant Reformation possible. The Black Death left Europe permanently different. It was the greatest catastrophe in European history, and the responses to it, the astrology, the self-flagellation, the persecution, were not the responses of savages. They were the responses of a civilization doing its desperate best with what it had. The tools were inadequate. The emergency was beyond anything in collective memory. The human impulse to explain, to act, to find a cause and a cure, that impulse was correct. The specific expressions of it were tragically, catastrophically wrong.
The funeral is arranged. The body is prepared. But before the burial can proceed, one more thing is needed. Someone sends for a specific person, a person most of the village would never normally speak to, never invite to their home, never acknowledge in the street. This person comes to the house, accepts a piece of bread, placed on or passed over the body of the deceased, eats it, and absorbs, through this ritual consumption, every sin the dead person committed in their lifetime. The family pays a small amount. The sin-eater leaves. The village goes back to not speaking to them. The sin-eater occupies one of the most remarkable ecological niches in the social history of folk religion. A figure whose entire function was to perform a service desperately valued by the community, who was then despised, avoided, and marginalized because they had performed it. The sin-eater was necessary and untouchable simultaneously, required and rejected by the same people in the same breath. The practice of sin-eating as a documented ritual is primarily associated with Wales, the Welsh-English border counties, particularly Shropshire and Herefordshire, and parts of Scotland and Ireland, with scattered references from other British regions. Its roots are difficult to trace precisely because it was a folk practice, conducted outside the official structures of the church, and rarely recorded by literate authorities who would write things down. Most of our documentation comes from antiquarians and folklorists working from the 17th century onward, who recorded practices that people in their localities described as ancient. The theological foundation of sin-eating draws on a deep human intuition about moral contamination and ritual transference. The idea that guilt, sin, or spiritual pollution can be moved from one person or object to another through symbolic action. This is the same logic underlying the biblical scapegoat, in which the sins of the Israelite community were ritually transferred to a goat, which was then driven into the wilderness. It is also the logic underlying confession and absolution in Catholic practice, though there the burden is transferred to God through the mediating function of the priest, not to another human being. The sin-eater's ritual worked through the medium of food. Bread was the most common vehicle, though accounts vary. Sometimes it was salt, sometimes both bread and salt, sometimes beer, sometimes other food. The specific food was placed on the body of the deceased, sometimes directly on the chest, sometimes passed over the body, sometimes simply offered in the presence of the body. The sin-eater ate the food. Through this consumption, by a logic that medieval and early modern folk theology found coherent, even if the official church did not, the sins of the dead were transferred to the sin eater. Why food? Food, in Christian theological tradition, carries enormous symbolic weight. The Eucharist, the central sacrament of Christianity, is food. The act of eating is incorporated into the deepest level of Christian spiritual practice as a mechanism of spiritual transformation. Folk theological extensions of this principle to other food-based rituals had deep cultural resonance, even if ecclesiastical authorities frowned upon them. People understood, in their bones and in their theological education, that eating could be a transformative act with spiritual consequences. For the deceased, the ritual offered crucial benefits. A person who died with sins unconfessed, which was common given that sudden death from accident or epidemic didn't allow for last rites, faced the possibility of a burdened soul in purgatory, working through those sins and suffering over an extended period before reaching heaven. The sin eater offered a shortcut: transfer the sins to a living human being, and the soul could proceed more freely. For families devastated by loss and worried about the eternal fate of their loved one, this was not a trivial consideration. It was an act of love, of care, of doing everything possible for the person who had just died. The Church's official position was complicated. The Catholic doctrine of indulgences, the purchase of spiritual credit to reduce time in purgatory, occupied adjacent theological territory. Prayers for the dead, masses offered for their souls, charitable donations in their name, all were accepted mechanisms for easing a soul's passage. The sin eater's ritual was less officially sanctioned, but drew on the same theological logic. After the Reformation, Protestant churches which rejected purgatory and indulgences had no theological space for sin eating at all. Yet the practice persisted in Protestant communities, suggesting its roots were deeper than any particular doctrinal framework. The social position of the sin eater was devastating. In accepting sins professionally, they became spiritually contaminated in the community's understanding. Each ritual added to their burden. They were accumulating the moral debts of the dead, and everyone in the community knew it. To associate with a sin eater was to associate with a person carrying the weight of others' sin, not an attractive proposition in a culture that understood sin as something real and dangerous. They ate alone. They were not invited to community events. They were not greeted normally in the street. When they had served their function at a funeral, they were paid and ushered out. Their social existence was that of a necessary ghost, present enough to be used, absent enough to be comfortable. What kind of person became a sin eater? The record suggests people with limited alternatives. Extreme poverty was characteristic. Often people already marginal in their communities, those without family networks, those who had already been socially isolated by circumstance or disability, those desperate enough that the small payment for the ritual justified the social cost. Once someone had performed the role, the stigma was permanent. You could not become a former sin eater. You had eaten sins, and everyone knew it. The last documented practicing sin eater in Britain is traditionally identified as Richard Munslow of Rattling Hope in Shropshire, who died in 1906. This date is remarkable, not medieval, not even Victorian in the traditional sense, but Edwardian, overlapping with the early years of the automobile and the airplane. The practice survived into the 20th century, preserved in isolated rural communities where folk traditions were maintained long past their urban disappearance. Munslow's grave fell into disrepair over the following century. In 2010, a community fundraising campaign restored it and conserved it. This was, depending on your perspective, either a touching act of historical acknowledgement or a delicious irony. The community finally treating with respect the man and the institution he represented that their predecessors had accepted and shunned in the same breath. The sin eater is in many ways the purest expression of a universal human need, to find someone else to carry what we cannot bear. Communities in need of the service produced the institution. Individuals in need of income filled the role.
and the community, relieved of its burden, expressed its gratitude in the only way available: continued employment and complete social rejection. It is a profoundly human arrangement and a genuinely heartbreaking one.
You wake up, you say your morning prayers, you know them by heart. You've said them every day since childhood. You check the calendar. Is today a fast day? Is it a feast day? Is it a day when sexual activity is prohibited? Because there are rules about all of these things, and the church enforces them. You dress, eat the appropriate food for the day's designation, and head to work. On the way, you pass the church. You go in, briefly, because in medieval Europe, the church is not just where you go on Sunday. The church is the framework inside which every moment of your life occurs. No institution in human history has exercised such comprehensive, intimate, and pervasive authority over daily life as the medieval Catholic Church at its height. Not the Roman Empire, which allowed considerable local variation. Not modern nation-states, which despite their extensive bureaucracies cannot reach into the private details of individual life the way the medieval church could and did. The church's authority in medieval Europe was total, not because of military force, though it had that, but because it was the organizing principle of reality itself. To be outside the church was not merely to be politically disenfranchised or socially marginalized. It was to be separated from the mechanism of salvation, the only process that mattered in a universe where earthly life was a brief and difficult passage to an eternal destiny. The church held the keys to heaven. Everyone who wanted to get there had to go through it. This gave the institution a leverage over human behavior that no secular authority could match. The church calendar structured time itself. The medieval year was not a neutral sequence of weeks and months, but a liturgical landscape of fasting, feasting, commemoration, celebration, and obligation. Sundays were sacred. So were the days of major saints, and the church recognized hundreds of saints, with feast days distributed throughout the year. Lent, the 40-day period before Easter, was a season of fasting, abstinence, and penitential practice. Advent, the period before Christmas, had its own disciplines. The weeks after Easter and Christmas had their own characters. The prohibited foods on fasting days, primarily meat, and in more rigorous interpretations also dairy and eggs, meant that a substantial portion of the year involved dietary restriction for the faithful. Fish was permitted, which is why the fish trade was economically significant, and why fish ponds were valuable ecclesiastical assets. The social and economic consequences of the fasting calendar rippled through the entire medieval economy. Food production, trade, agriculture, even construction were shaped by the church's liturgical demands. Sexual behavior was perhaps the area of most intimate church regulation. The church's sexual theology, developed over centuries by theologians from Augustine through Aquinas, held that sexual intercourse was permissible only within marriage, only for the purpose of procreation, and only at times not prohibited by liturgical designation. The days on which sexual activity was prohibited included Sundays, dedicated to God, Wednesdays, a day of fasting in the early church tradition, Fridays, the day of Christ's crucifixion, Saturdays, preparation for Sunday, the entire 40 days of Lent, the entire 40 days of Advent, the 8 days following Easter, the 8 days following Pentecost, the eve of major feast days, and the period during and after a wife's menstrual cycle. Medieval theologians who calculated these restrictions arrived at figures suggesting that perhaps 60 to 100 days per year were technically permissible for sexual activity within marriage. Some calculations landed even lower. How rigorously these rules were enforced and observed is difficult to know. Enforcement depended on confession, since private behavior left no external record, and confessors varied widely in strictness. But the rules were real, publicly known, and regularly preached. Sin was matter for confession.
Confession was the mechanism by which sin was absolved and the soul's state managed. The church's access to private behavior therefore ran through the confessional, an institution of remarkable intimacy that required individuals to narrate their most private actions to a priest, annually at minimum, more frequently in rigorous practice. The confessional gave the church extraordinary social intelligence. Priests knew the secrets of their parishioners. This knowledge was protected by the seal of confession. Priests could not reveal what they heard, but it shaped the church's understanding of its community in ways that gave it remarkable social leverage. It also created the possibility of abuse, which documented cases confirm was real. The condemnation of usury represents one of the church's most consequential economic interventions. Medieval theology, drawing on biblical prohibitions and Aristotelian philosophy, held that money was sterile. It could not naturally reproduce itself, and to charge interest was therefore unnatural and sinful. The prohibition was taken seriously by ecclesiastical authorities, who could threaten excommunication for usurers. The practical consequence was to remove most Christians from the lending business, or rather to push lending into various evasions, workarounds, and euphemisms, while simultaneously creating a market niche filled primarily by Jewish communities who were not subject to church law. The economic association of Jewish communities with money lending was not a product of Jewish character or preference, but Christian religious law creating a space only non-Christians could legally occupy. The resulting resentment of the only people willing to provide a service the economy desperately needed fueled centuries of anti-Semitic hostility. Medieval Christian anti-Semitism was not solely economic, but the usury prohibition contributed to it structurally, materially, and over a very long period. Purgatory and the economy of salvation represent perhaps the most extraordinary institutional achievement of the medieval church. The doctrine of purgatory, the intermediate states in which souls with remaining sin burned away their impurities before entering heaven, was developed gradually and reached its full elaborated form in the 12th and 13th centuries. Its implications were enormous. If souls in purgatory could be helped by the prayers and actions of the living, a doctrine the church affirmed, then the living had both the opportunity and obligation to assist their deceased loved ones. Masses could be offered for the dead, their benefit accruing to the soul in purgatory. Charitable works done in a dead person's name could shorten their stay, and indulgences, certificates issued by church authority that granted remission of sin for punishment, could be purchased and applied to the dead as well as the living. The indulgence market was not a corruption of the medieval church's intent. It was the church's intent formalized and administered. Popes and bishops issued indulgences in exchange for donations, pilgrimages, participation in crusades, and other acts of merit. The money raised supported church projects, including, most famously, the construction of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome in the early 15th century, the indulgence campaign for which triggered Martin Luther's protest. The church that Luther opposed was not a medieval institution in decline. It was a medieval institution at the height of its institutional sophistication, exercising an economic, moral, and existential authority over European Christians that had been built over more than a millennium. Luther's 95 Theses were an attack on the specific mechanism, indulgences, that made the system's excesses most visible. But the system was vast, and dismantling it required not just theological argument, but the printing press, political support from sympathetic German princes, and the accumulated resentment of a century of reform movements. The church that regulated medieval life built the universities that educated it. It preserved classical learning through the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. It provided welfare, hospitals, food distribution, care for the elderly and orphans in a world without state social services. It produced extraordinary art, music, architecture, and literature. It was, simultaneously, an institution of tremendous human achievement and one of history's most effective mechanisms for controlling human behavior in the service of institutional interest. Medieval people who lived within its framework were not passive victims of a totalitarian institution. Most of them believed, sincerely and deeply, in the theological framework that gave the church its authority. Their faith was real. Their obedience was, in most cases, an expression of genuine belief rather than mere coercion. And within that framework, the church offered something genuinely valuable, an account of human existence that gave it meaning, cosmic context, communal structure, and the hope of eternal life. It is possible to recognize both the genuine spiritual sustenance the medieval church provided and the extraordinary, invasive, and often brutal authority it exercised over every aspect of human life. Holding both is the only honest way to look at it. History, as always, refuses to offer clean conclusions. So, there you have it. 12 things that were completely, utterly, and unreservedly normal in medieval Europe. Hot iron justice, safety coffins with bells, pigs in human clothing standing trial for murder, doctors draining your blood